A young black woman, who was about 8 months pregnant, was excitedly heading to the local store on a warm afternoon. She was beaming with joy, thinking about the baby she'd be welcoming soon. She prepared a list of groceries and essentials to stock up on before the baby's arrival, so everything would be ready. Her husband had wanted to come along, but he had an important work meeting, so she told him she'd be fine on her own. After all, she'd just be out for a quick trip, and it was a lovely day for a drive. As she was driving through her neighborhood, she noticed flashing blue and red lights in her rearview mirror. A police car was signaling for her to pull over. She was a bit startled, but assumed it must be a minor mistake or routine check. She hadn't been speeding or doing anything wrong. Still, she dutifully pulled over, thinking the officer might simply want to check her license and send her on her way. The officer approached her car with a serious look on his face. She greeted him politely, trying to stay calm despite her nerves. But instead of explaining why he had stopped her, he began questioning her in a sharp tone, asking what she was doing in this neighborhood. His questions felt out of place. This was her own neighborhood. She'd lived here for years with her husband. Feeling a bit taken aback, she explained that she was on her way to the store. However, the officer's expression didn't soften. In fact, he seemed to grow more suspicious, as if he doubted her every word. Without explaining his reasons, he started asking invasive questions, making her feel increasingly uncomfortable. Her hands were resting on her belly, and she gently reminded him that she was pregnant, hoping he might show some understanding. But instead, he scoffed, his tone dismissive as he continued his harsh line of questioning. He even went so far as to make offhand comments about people like her, as if she was in the wrong place or doing something she shouldn't be. The officer didn't seem to care that she was carrying a child. Despite her attempts to cooperate, he ordered her out of the car and began looking through her vehicle without her permission. She stood by the roadside, feeling both humiliated and helpless. She couldn't understand why this was happening, especially here, so close to her home. Other drivers passed by, some glancing at the scene, and a few looked visibly disturbed by what they saw. One passerby, a kind-hearted person who had witnessed enough, decided to pull out their phone and quietly record the incident from a distance. They felt this woman's unfair treatment couldn't go unnoticed. They intended to make sure someone knew what had happened here, so this experience wouldn't simply be swept under the rug. The woman felt grateful for the stranger's silent support, though she still wished this had never happened. She was left standing on the side of the road, hoping that this difficult moment would soon be over. The officer continued his questioning with an unfriendly tone, showing no signs of easing up. The young woman tried to stay calm, answering politely, but her patience was wearing thin. All she wanted was to go to the store and finish her errands without any trouble. But the officer didn't seem to care. He acted as if she had done something wrong just by being there. As he looked through her car without asking permission, she began to feel a mix of frustration and helplessness. She wanted to tell him he had no right to search her vehicle, but she worried that speaking up might make things worse. She didn't want to do anything that might cause a confrontation, especially in her condition. So she stood by quietly, hoping this ordeal would end soon. But the officer wasn't done. His questions became more personal and demeaning, and he even made a few remarks about her appearance and the neighborhood. He acted like she didn't belong, as if he doubted she could actually live there. She tried to explain, calmly, that this was her home, that she and her husband had been part of the community for years. But her words didn't seem to matter to him. At one point, she gently placed her hand on her belly, hoping it might remind him that she was expecting a child. She hoped he might show even a little compassion. But he only glanced at her belly for a moment, then looked away, as if it meant nothing to him. The reality of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. The officer had already made up his mind about her, and he was treating her differently because of it. Meanwhile, the stranger who had been watching the entire scene from a distance kept their phone pointed at the situation, recording everything quietly. They felt uneasy about how the officer was treating this young woman, especially given her condition. The stranger knew that recording this moment could be important. Sometimes, a recording was the only way to make sure people in power couldn't ignore what had happened. Minutes felt like hours as the officer continued his rude questioning. The young woman's heart was racing, and she felt exhausted from standing there under the hot sun. She was doing her best to stay strong, but she couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness. She kept reminding herself that all she needed to do was get through this moment and get home safely. Just when she thought it might never end, the officer's radio crackled with the loud call. He listened to the message, his expression changing slightly, though he didn't let on what it meant. After a moment, he muttered something under his breath, clearly annoyed. Finally, he turned to the young woman and, without an apology, told her she could leave. Then he simply walked back to his car, leaving her there by the roadside. The woman took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of relief and frustration. She got back into her car, hands still trembling, and drove off. All she wanted now was to go home and put this horrible experience behind her. Little did she know, though, that this was far from over. This incident would soon take a turn neither she nor the officer could have expected. As the young woman drove home, her hands were still shaking from the encounter. She tried to steady her breathing and focus on the road, but her mind kept replaying what had just happened. She hadn't expected to be treated that way, especially in her own neighborhood, and especially not with her baby so close to being born. She felt a mix of emotions, hurt, anger, and confusion, and wondered why the officer had singled her out. She thought of all the things she could have said but held back, all the ways she had hoped he'd show understanding, but he hadn't. When she finally got home, her husband was already there, waiting to hear how her day had gone. The moment he saw her face, he could tell something was wrong. She looked shaken, her usually bright smile nowhere to be seen. He rushed over to her, concerned, and gently asked if everything was okay. As she started to tell him about the encounter, she could feel the emotions rise up again. She tried to keep her voice steady, but her frustration and sadness were clear. Her husband listened quietly, his jaw tightening as he heard each detail, from the officer's harsh words to the way he'd searched her car without any explanation. Hearing her story, he couldn't believe what had happened to his wife, especially so close to home and with her being pregnant. But as she spoke, he noticed something she hadn't yet mentioned: the recording. The stranger who had been there had captured everything, a fact that her husband knew could make a big difference. Gently, he asked if she knew who had recorded it and if they might have the footage. That's when she remembered the bystander who had been filming from a distance. It was the one glimmer of hope she'd felt during the whole encounter, a reminder that someone had seen what happened and hadn't agreed with it. Her husband suggested they try to find the person and see if they would be willing to share the video. He had a quiet but determined look in his eyes, one she knew well. She could tell he was planning something but wasn't yet ready to reveal it. As they talked, her husband reassured her that he would handle it, that she didn't need to worry. He asked her to focus on resting and taking care of herself and the baby, but he knew he had to act. He wasn't just a husband or a soon-to-be father. He had a job that gave him the power to stand up for his wife in a way most people wouldn't expect. And though he hadn't told her yet, he planned to use that power. With a few calls, he found out who had the video and made arrangements to get a copy. His mind raced as he thought of the best way to ensure that this officer would be held accountable. He knew that what had happened wasn't just about his wife. It was about making sure that no one else would have to go through a similar experience. And he also knew that the officer had no idea who he was dealing with or what was coming next. The young woman spent the evening trying to relax, but the stress from the day's encounter still weighed on her. She moved around the house slowly, making tea and trying to find little ways to calm herself. Her husband, meanwhile, was in the other room, quietly but busily making a series of phone calls. She noticed he was speaking in a low, serious tone, and she knew he was handling things in his own way. Though she wasn't sure what he was planning, she trusted him completely. She knew he was determined to make things right. After he finished his calls, he came back to sit with her. He held her hand, reassuring her with a calm, steady presence that she found comforting. He explained gently that he had taken steps to make sure the officer's actions wouldn't go unnoticed. He told her not to worry, and that he would handle everything from here. He even managed to make her smile with a little joke, trying to lift her spirits. The next day, he had arranged to meet the person who had recorded the video. He thanked them for stepping up and for their willingness to share the footage. It meant a lot to him, knowing someone had cared enough to stand up for his wife, even if it was just by capturing the truth of what had happened. With the video now in his possession, he felt more determined than ever. He knew he would use it to make sure the officer faced consequences. Later that afternoon, he headed to the police station, where he had requested a meeting with the police chief and a few other important figures. As he walked into the building, he felt calm, but there was also a quiet intensity in his eyes. He was not only a man protecting his family, but he was also an advocate for justice, and this meeting was a chance to make sure things changed. When he entered the conference room, he found several people already seated, including the police chief and the officer who had pulled his wife over. The officer looked surprised when he saw the young woman's husband. He clearly hadn't expected him to be here, let alone in a position of authority. There was an awkward silence in the room as the officer quickly realized he had no idea who he dealt with the day before. The husband wasted no time getting to the point. He spoke clearly and firmly, explaining the events of the previous day and emphasizing how the officer's behavior had been both unprofessional and deeply inappropriate. The police chief and others in the room listened carefully, their expressions growing more serious as they took in each detail. The officer looked uncomfortable, but he tried to keep his composure, possibly hoping to brush off the situation. Then, the husband played the video. The room fell silent as everyone watched the recording. The footage captured every word, every moment of disrespect, and the officer's harsh treatment of his pregnant wife. It was clear, undeniable proof of what had happened. As the video ended, the officer's face went pale. He could no longer deny or downplay his actions. He looked around, realizing there was no easy way out of this situation. The police chief turned to the officer with a disappointed look, clearly realizing that this incident could not be ignored. The husband stayed calm, though his words were filled with quiet strength. He didn't raise his voice or make threats, but his message was clear. This behavior couldn't go unpunished. He was here not only to protect his wife, but to ensure that no one else would have to face this kind of treatment. After the meeting ended, the officer was asked to step out, while the husband stayed to discuss possible actions. The police chief assured him they would handle it, promising that there would be a full investigation. For the first time since the incident, the young woman's husband felt a sense of relief, knowing that steps were being taken to bring justice. As he left the station, he felt proud, not only for standing up for his wife, but also for standing up for what was right. The husband walked out of the police station, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders, but he knew this was just the beginning. As he got into his car, his mind was still buzzing with everything that had happened. He had seen the shocked look on the officer's face and the serious expressions from the police chief and the others. He hoped that this would lead to real change, but he wasn't Maeve. He knew that it wasn't easy to shift attitudes, and it would take more than one meeting to make a difference. When he got home, his wife was waiting anxiously. She had been resting, but she couldn't stop thinking about the meeting, wondering what had happened. She had tried to distract herself, even reading a book to pass the time, but her mind kept drifting back to the events of the previous day and how her husband was handling it. When he walked through the door, she immediately went to him, searching his face for answers. He sat down with her and explained everything in detail, describing how the meeting had gone and the way the officer reacted when he saw the video. She listened closely, feeling a mix of emotions as he described the officer's surprise and discomfort. While part of her felt relieved that steps were being taken, another part of her still felt a lingering sadness over what had happened. She couldn't shake the memory of how she'd felt standing there, humiliated and helpless. But hearing her husband's calm, reassuring voice reminded her that she wasn't alone in this. They sat together in silence for a moment, both taking in the weight of the day's events. Then, her husband gently took her hand and told her that he would do everything in his power to make sure this kind of treatment stopped. He spoke with quiet determination, telling her that he was ready to push for real change, not just for her, but for anyone who might be treated unfairly. His words gave her hope, and she felt grateful for his support. Over the next few days, word of the incident began to spread quietly through their community. The bystander who had recorded the video had shared it with a few trusted friends, and soon, more people knew what had happened. Neighbors, friends, and even a few people from her husband's work reached out to show their support. Some shared stories of their own, telling of times they or someone they knew had faced similar situations. The young woman and her husband realized they were not alone. This experience was, sadly, something too many people understood all too well. The growing support from the community gave her husband even more motivation. He started reaching out to local organizations and leaders, looking for ways to make a difference. He attended meetings, made phone calls, and had long conversations with people who were just as determined to see change as he was. Each step he took brought him closer to his goal of making sure no one else would have to go through what his wife had experienced. At home, the young woman found herself slowly healing, thanks to the support around her. The memory of the incident was still painful, but knowing that her community cared helped ease her mind. She found herself thinking less about the officer and more about all the good people who had come forward to stand by her. She began to feel a new sense of purpose too, hoping that sharing her story might help others in similar situations. One evening, she and her husband sat together, talking about everything that had happened since that day. They talked about the changes they hoped to see and how they could continue pushing for fairness and understanding in their community. They didn't know what the future held, but they felt ready to face it together, stronger and more united than ever. In that quiet moment, sitting side by side, they knew that this experience had brought them closer, not only as a couple, but as a part of a community that believed in standing up for each other. In the days that followed, the young woman and her husband received more support than they ever expected. Messages poured in from friends, neighbors, and even people they barely knew. They shared kind words, telling the young woman how brave she was for staying calm in such a difficult situation, and how proud they were of her husband for standing up for her. Each message made her feel a little stronger, a little more hopeful that things would change. But it wasn't just friends and neighbors reaching out. People from local organizations started contacting her husband, offering resources and suggesting ways to bring awareness to what had happened. They invited him to attend community meetings and speak about their experience to help others understand why change was needed. With so many people coming together, it became clear that this was more than just a single incident. It was an opportunity to start important conversations in their community. The young woman watched her husband take on this role with determination. Each night, he came home a little more tired, but also a little more driven. He would sit with her, telling her about his meetings and how the community leaders were planning to address these issues. Sometimes he would shake his head, frustrated by how much work lay ahead, but he always reminded her that every small step mattered. One evening, he mentioned a public forum being held by the town council. It was a chance for citizens to speak openly with city officials about issues that affected them. He asked her if she'd like to attend with him. At first, she felt nervous about the idea. She wasn't sure if she wanted to share her story in front of so many people. But then she thought about how many people had supported her, how many others had reached out with similar experiences, and how much courage her husband had shown through it all. She realized that this was her chance to make a difference. On the day of the forum, they arrived at the town hall together. The room was packed with people from all backgrounds. Some were there to talk about local projects or ask questions about community resources. but others were there specifically because they'd heard about what had happened to her. Seeing so many people gathered gave her a sense of strength she hadn't expected. She felt the nervousness settle a bit as she looked around and saw familiar, supportive faces in the crowd. When it was their turn to speak, her husband took her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze before stepping up to the microphone. He introduced them and began sharing their story. He spoke about the difficult day she'd had, the officer's treatment, and the importance of accountability and fairness. Then he turned to her, nodding gently, giving her the space to speak if she wanted to. She took a deep breath, feeling her heart race, but she knew this was her moment. As she began to speak, her voice was soft but clear. She shared how she had felt that day, how humiliating and frightening it had been, especially as an expecting mother. She explained that she wasn't there to blame anyone, but to raise awareness about the need for respect and fairness for everyone. As she spoke, she saw nods of understanding from the crowd, and she felt a sense of relief wash over her. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment, and then applause filled the space. People stood up, some even wiping away tears, moved by her courage. She looked over at her husband, who was smiling with pride. They had faced something painful together, and now they were standing here, united in front of their community, hoping to bring about change. As they left the forum that night, people came up to thank her and shake her hand. She felt overwhelmed by the support and the kindness of those around her. She realized that by sharing her experience, she hadn't just spoken for herself. She had spoken for countless others who needed a voice. For the first time since that difficult day, she felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that her story had made a difference. And with her husband by her side, she knew they would keep pushing forward, bringing light to their community, one step at a time. After the town forum, life started to settle back into a more comfortable routine for the young woman and her husband. Though the memory of that day was still there, it wasn't as sharp or painful. Instead, it felt like they had transformed a difficult experience into something meaningful. The community's support continued, and they knew their story had left a positive impact, sparking conversations that would carry on for a long time. In the days that followed, the young woman felt a new sense of purpose. She and her husband began spending more time volunteering at local events, meeting with community groups, and attending gatherings focused on building understanding and respect among people. She could feel herself growing through this journey, becoming more confident. What had once been a painful experience was now a source of strength. One day, she received a call from a local organization that worked to improve relations between citizens and the police force. They had heard her story and were inspired by her courage. They wanted to know if she would consider speaking at one of their upcoming events, where people shared their experiences and worked together on ways to make the community feel safer and more welcoming for everyone. The thought of speaking in public again made her a bit nervous, but she remembered how powerful it had felt to share her story at the town forum. She discussed it with her husband, who was supportive and encouraged her to go for it. He reminded her that she didn't have to be perfect. Just sharing her truth would be enough. With his encouragement, she agreed to attend. The day of the event arrived, and she found herself standing in a room filled with people from all walks of life. Community leaders, police officers, social workers, and ordinary citizens who wanted to make a difference. She could feel the energy in the room, a shared desire for change and progress. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that this wasn't just about her story. It was about everyone who had ever felt judged or misunderstood. When it was her turn to speak, she walked to the front of the room, feeling a blend of nerves and excitement. She started by describing the events of that difficult day, the feelings of fear and frustration, and the disappointment in realizing that some people still made judgments based on appearance. But then she talked about the power of community, the incredible support she had received, and the sense of unity that had helped her heal. As she looked around, she could see the attentive faces, people nodding in agreement and understanding. Her words resonated with the audience, and she could feel the connection. After her talk, several people approached her, including a few police officers who wanted to listen and understand her perspective. They thanked her for her honesty and promised to work toward better communication and respect in their interactions with the public. Their response gave her hope that change was possible, even if it happened one conversation at a time. Over the next few weeks, the young woman and her husband continued their involvement in the community, feeling more connected and hopeful than ever. Their story had inspired people, bringing them together in a way they hadn't anticipated. She felt a sense of peace knowing that she and her husband had not only stood up for themselves, but also for others who had faced similar situations. They were building something positive out of a negative experience, turning a moment of pain into a bridge toward understanding. One evening, as she and her husband sat together at home, he looked at her with admiration, telling her how proud he was of her strength and compassion. They talked about how far they had come since that day and how they wanted to continue being a part of positive change. They knew it wouldn't always be easy, but they felt ready to face any challenges that might come. The young woman smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. She had turned her pain into purpose, her fear into courage, and her frustration into hope. And she knew that whatever came next, she would face it with strength, surrounded by a community that believed in standing together and supporting one another. As weeks turned into months, the young woman and her husband continued to find new ways to engage with their community. They became regular attendees at local meetings focused on building better relationships between residents and law enforcement. With each meeting, they learned more about the issues that people face daily, and they shared their experiences openly. It felt good to be part of something bigger than themselves, and they loved seeing the community come together to discuss important topics. One day, the couple was invited to participate in a community workshop designed to educate people about their rights when interacting with the police. This workshop aimed to empower residents with knowledge, helping them feel safe and informed. The young woman felt excited and a bit nervous about participating, but her husband encouraged her. He reminded her how powerful their story had been and how sharing their experiences could help others. At the workshop, attendees ranged from young students to older community members, all eager to learn. The couple was welcomed warmly, and the organizers asked them to share their story. They stood in front of the audience, their hearts pounding, but they were determined to convey the importance of respect and understanding in every interaction. As they spoke, the young woman felt a rush of emotions. She shared how the officers' actions had affected her deeply, especially being pregnant at the time. But she also emphasized how important it was for everyone to know their rights and to stand up for themselves with respect and dignity. Her husband added that communication was key, and that both citizens and police officers needed to work together to foster trust. Their words resonated with the audience, sparking conversations that followed their presentation. After the workshop, many people came up to them to express their gratitude. Some shared their own stories of encounters with law enforcement, feeling a sense of relief that they could talk about it openly. The couple listened attentively, offering support and understanding. They realized that by sharing their experiences, they had created a safe space for others to voice their feelings, and that felt incredibly rewarding. As their involvement grew, they also began to collaborate with local organizations focused on social justice. They organized events aimed at bringing people together to share food, stories, and laughter. These gatherings not only strengthened community ties, but also created opportunities for meaningful dialogue. The couple found joy in these moments as they witnessed how people from different backgrounds could connect over shared experiences. One particular event, a community picnic, turned out to be a huge success. People from all walks of life came together, bringing dishes to share and stories to tell. The atmosphere was filled with laughter, music, and a sense of togetherness that made the couple's hearts swell with pride. As they walked around, chatting with different groups, they felt the warmth of community spirit wrap around them. It was a beautiful reminder that despite challenges, there was so much good in the world. During the picnic, they had the opportunity to speak again. They expressed their gratitude for everyone's support and highlighted the importance of continued conversations about respect and understanding. The crowd listened intently, and when they finished speaking, a wave of applause erupted. The couple exchanged proud smiles, knowing they were helping to inspire change in their community. After the picnic, the couple received messages from people expressing their gratitude for the event and sharing how much it meant to them. They felt a renewed sense of purpose, realizing that their efforts were making a difference. People were talking, sharing, and working together to build a more inclusive environment. With each passing day, the couple continued to learn and grow. They made new friends, expanded their networks, and became more deeply involved in community issues. They attended workshops, organized events, and found themselves becoming advocates for change, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever felt marginalized or misunderstood. Reflecting on how far they had come, the young woman felt a sense of accomplishment. They had turned a painful experience into something beautiful and constructive. Together, they were not just healing, but actively contributing to a better future for their community. With her husband by her side, she felt empowered to keep pushing for change and to support others on their journeys, knowing that together they could create a more just and understanding world. As the months rolled on, the young woman and her husband found themselves more deeply entrenched in their community than they ever imagined. They had initially shared their story to find healing for themselves, but it had transformed into a mission to inspire and connect with others. Each event they attended, each conversation they had, brought new energy and purpose to their lives. They felt they were part of something larger, a movement toward greater understanding and compassion among people. One day, the couple received an invitation to participate in a community panel discussion on the topic of police accountability. They were excited, but also nervous. This was an opportunity to speak not only about their experiences, but also about the changes they hoped to see in their town. They knew that sharing their story in a public forum could lead to deeper discussions about community safety, respect, and the need for accountability. On the day of the panel, they arrived at the venue filled with anticipation. The room was set up with chairs arranged in a circle, creating an inviting space for open dialogue. Various community members, including local leaders, police officers, and residents, were present. The couple took their seats and felt a mix of excitement and nerves as they prepared to share their story once again. When it was their turn to speak, the young woman took a deep breath and began. She spoke about that fateful day, how she felt during the encounter with the police officer, and the support they had received since. She emphasized the importance of accountability and how a single action could have lasting effects on someone's life. Her husband chimed in, highlighting the need for understanding and communication between police and the community. Their words sparked a genuine conversation among the attendees. After they spoke, the panel opened up for questions. The atmosphere in the room was charged with energy as people expressed their thoughts and experiences. One police officer shared a personal story about how he had witnessed negative interactions with citizens and how it had affected him. He expressed a desire to build bridges and foster trust. The couple listened intently, realizing that change was possible when both sides were willing to engage in meaningful dialogue. The discussion continued for over an hour, and the couple felt encouraged as they listened to various perspectives. Many attendees shared their own experiences, both positive and negative. The young woman felt grateful for the openness in the room. It was clear that everyone wanted to move toward a better understanding of each other. By the end of the panel, there was a sense of unity and a shared commitment to work together toward positive change. After the event, people approached the couple to thank them for their bravery and honesty. Some even asked for advice on how to engage with their own communities. The couple was humbled by the response and eager to help others find their voices. They exchanged contact information with several attendees, hoping to stay connected and continue the conversation. Feeling inspired, they decided to organize a follow-up event to keep the momentum going. They envisioned a community gathering that would bring people together to share stories, resources, and ideas for fostering a stronger, more respectful community. With the help of local organizations, they began planning what would become a series of gatherings, each one focused on dialogue and understanding. The first gathering was a warm, sunny Saturday afternoon at a local park. Families brought food, children played, and people of all ages mingled. The atmosphere was filled with laughter and chatter, creating a welcoming environment. The couple opened the event by sharing their story once again, emphasizing that everyone's voice mattered. They encouraged others to share their experiences and engage in conversations that could help bridge gaps. As the afternoon progressed, people began sharing their stories, discussing their struggles and victories. They talked about their hopes for the community and how they could support one another. The couple listened, encouraged, and facilitated discussions, feeling a sense of pride in the connections being made. By the end of the day, the young woman felt overwhelmed with joy. They had created a safe space for people to come together and discuss important issues, and the response was more than they had hoped for. As they cleaned up, she and her husband exchanged glances, both knowing that this was just the beginning. They were committed to fostering a culture of respect and understanding, and they could see that others were just as eager to join in.